This is Napa, the main city of Napa Valley, one of the wine capitals of the world. There are hundreds of wineries in Napa Valley, which is approximately 30 miles in length and 5 miles in width. Flowing down the center of the valley is the Napa River, which eventually empties into the San Pablo Bay. Many tourists visit the city of Napa every year, primarily during the spring, summer, and fall. They come to enjoy the town's wineries and wonderful restaurants. There are also many activities that people enjoy here in Napa, such as hiking, bicycling, kayaking, and riding hot air balloons. However, during the wintertime, Napa gets a lot of rain and is prone to flooding during that time. Napa has had a long history of flooding. Since 1862, Napa has experienced 21 serious floods, each of which have caused destruction to both the city of Napa and to people's lives. After many years of planning, the city of Napa has developed a project to prevent floods. Today, the risk of damage by a flood has gone down. I and a few Napa residents and experts on the subject will be talking about Napa's floods and the Napa River Flood Project. This is Trancas Crossing Park, which is a 33-acre space that provides trails, parking lot and pedestrian access, and even access to the Napa River. In addition to being a park that many people enjoy, Trancas Crossing Park is a part of the floodplain of the Napa River. Over here is a flood marker which shows how high the water has risen during 4 serious floods in Napa's history. At the bottom, the marker shows the water level for the 1997 flood, which was 6 feet above this plain. Both the 1995 and 2005 floods were more severe than the 1997 flood, with a water level of 8.5 feet. And at the very top, the final marker shows the most serious flood in Napa's history, the infamous 1986 flood, during which 12.5 feet of water covered this area.
1986 was the most damaging flood of modern times, and I believe Napa's had a dozen or more floods, could be 15, 16, since settlement in the mid-1800s.
Kevin Courtney is the city editor of the Napa Valley Register, which has been Napa's hometown newspaper since 1863. He has lived in Napa since 1973 and remembers several of Napa's floods that have occurred in the last 30 years. Later on, Mr. Courtney will speak about the Napa River Flood Project and what makes it unique.
But I think there was a tranquil period from World War II, early 50s, up until 86, maybe 2 or 3 decades, when there weren't any significant floods. So when the 86 flood came, it was a real shocker. Napa was a sea of water all along Auto Row, up Soskel, way into downtown. The river flooded from Main Street all the way up to Coombs Street, past Brown Street, to around the courthouse. And Napa Creek in those days would flood very easily. Where Walmart is, all of that was underwater. Neighborhoods north of Lincoln, south of Lincoln, along the river were underwater.
So the 86 flood, I was in high school. I lived in American Canyon, so it didn't affect my home. I wasn't really working then, but I remember the gymnasium was used for a shelter for all the people that were put out. That was kind of odd to have people staying in your gym while you're going to high school, but that was a big deal.
As a Napa resident and hairdresser for Shine Salon, Shayna Cook lived through a few of the floods in Napa and helped people deal with them. Next up is Andrew Dixon, who was born in St. Helena, grew up in Napa, lived in Oakland for a time, but moved to the city of Napa 4 years ago. He currently owns Napa Valley Paddle, which offers kayak and paddleboard tours on the Napa River.
Well, the biggest flood, as you probably have heard and seen pictures, was the 1986 flood. So I was in elementary school, 9 years old, I believe, 11 during that. And that was, you really got a sense of how powerful nature can be and how insignificant and really helpless the human community can be when that was a 100-year flood event. So my experience was up valley, and I'll tell you right now, at the base of Howe Mountain, the Silverado Trail was a raging river, and we couldn't get off the mountain.
My husband, in the mid-'80s, there was a flood that affected their house greatly, and they were right near where the riverbank came over, and it was 4 feet deep throughout his whole house. So that was pretty significant.
I do not recall the damage total. I recall at least one person died when they ran off Solano Avenue into a ditch filled with water. There may have been a second death. But the damage, and this is $86, was $50, $100 million.
Just like Kevin Courtney said, the 1986 flood caused $100 million of damage. 20% of the Napa Valley's vineyards were destroyed. 2,500 residences were damaged, while 250 were completely destroyed. This resulted in 5,000 people ending up in shelters, hotels, and friends' homes, and 1,500 people temporarily unemployed. The next decade, Napa experienced more floods. Shayna Cook vividly remembers the flood that occurred in the mid-1990s.
My family owned a restaurant at that point, and that we were up valley visiting Yountville, and while I was in the shops in Yountville, the police came through and evacuated Yountville. So we knew that was a pretty big deal if the whole city was getting evacuated. So we left, and my in-laws happened to be they left for Hawaii that day. So we got some friends together and went and got sandbags. By the time we came to the restaurant, which was right down on Pearl Street, we had about 25 friends there waiting for us to open the doors. And in about 15 minutes, we had everything above waist level and had the place sandbagged. And it's kind of become a way of life. When a lot of rain starts coming, you start checking the weather reports and listening to the radio, and it does become a way of life for a while.
The one that occurred in 2005, of course, is the one in most recent recollection, and therefore the one about which I personally know the most. And that flood caused a great deal of damage because of the overflow of the riverbanks in downtown Napa, particularly in the Napa River, Napa Creek area, which has traditionally been the premier flooding zone in downtown Napa.
Nancy Levenberg is the executive director of the Napa County Historical Society, and she has lived in Napa since 1989. She is very familiar with the 2005 flood as well as the Napa River Flood Project. Now, there was a common misconception about the reason for the occurrences of Napa's past floods, and Andrew Dixon is back on the screen to talk more about that.
I'll tell you the biggest thing from what I recollect from my college years and being fortunate enough to follow it closely was, some old, wives' tales, right? And the big one was the effect of the tides on the river and the flooding. And it was a very everybody assumed it to be true. The very, widely spread notion that there was nothing we could do about the flooding here because if it occurred when the tide was high, it's just, there's nothing we can do. In fact, the flooding has to do with allowing the water to move through and reintroducing the wetlands south of town, which act as a reservoir for that water.
It was discovered that one of the things that was causing the flooding, perhaps the major influence on the flooding in the Napa Valley, were all the different culverts and dams and roadways and bridges that had in effect been constructed by human beings in order to serve the agricultural purposes of the valley. The unique agricultural environment and beautiful landscape, beautiful natural environment that we have here in the Napa Valley, and the efforts of both, or all three, federal, state, and local officials to relieve our local population from the periodic flooding and the damage that it causes, really conceived of the entire course of the Napa River Valley, as the area that they were going to address in the flood control project.
The thought at the time was that you would line the riverbank from Amola all the way up to Lincoln or Trancas Street with rock, or create sheer cement walls. You would turn it into a drainage ditch. That was what critics said. And I believe there was a public vote in the 80s to tax ourselves to build this flood channel. And the critics said it would look like the LA River, which is a drainage culvert. And our river wasn't that much prettier in downtown. It had warehouses going right up to the edge. It was very industrial, like something you would see back in an old factory town in Connecticut or New Jersey. But it was pretty as you went up toward Lincoln, and it meanders, and it was, it had charm.
But there was tremendous opposition to the flood control plan that would destroy the river's natural beauty.
But that flood control plan, the channelization of the river, which was pushed by the Army Corps of Engineers, that was the standard design, was defeated. So we went years with no flood protection, and suddenly floods, not quite of the 86 magnitude, started happening regularly. And I believe one year we had 2 of them, to the extent that homes flooded, businesses flooded, where we are right now would have flooded, fairgrounds would have flooded, Auto Row flooded. It was just bad news. Nothing catastrophic, but a real mess. And it really prevented anyone from wanting to build in the center part of the city because it was high risk. So you had all that wonderfully valuable real estate in central Napa that was derelict because it was in a flood zone. And why would you build there?
Everyone agreed on flood protection in Napa, but how could this be done in a way that could preserve the river's natural beauty?
But what the project needed to do was return the Napa River to its original courses and recreate a riparian habitat around the rivers that would support the sort of natural life that would have occurred on the banks of the river had the river been allowed to do its thing. So that the flood control project in general is working towards restoring the Napa River to its original course and to tame some of the damming and culverting and troughing and irrigation works that have been set up to feed off the Napa River.
I remember that the bridges acted as dams, and so what would happen was it was like a wall of rock with arches cut out of it, and it in big flood events, it would create a dam and push that water into the streets. I think in 2005 that was addressed, and so the impact was much less in 2005.
The Napa Flood Project has attempted to turn the Napa River back into its original healthy path that the river wants to take, instead of forcing it to conform to the way that we had buildings and streets already planned out around Napa. So they've taken back a lot of the land that the river wants to flood on they've made it a healthier situation so that the river can expand and contract with the rains and not impact any of the local businesses' houses.
One of the most important features of the flood project is the Oxbow Dry Bypass, which is where I'm standing right now. It is a major part of the Napa River flood project. The Napa River follows a large bend called an oxbow as it flows through downtown Napa. As Megan suggests, when rivers flood, the water wants to follow the path of least resistance. In this case, the Napa River historically has overflowed at this bend. The Oxbow Dry Bypass is an area where floodwaters can overflow without causing damage. The Oxbow Dry Bypass also provides space for wildlife, a path for pedestrians, and open space for special occasions. I have also seen many skateboarders skate up and down this area. This is the Napa Creek, which historically would jump its banks during a flood event as a result of the water having no other place to go. A part of the Napa River Flood Project involved the construction of box culverts that would allow the water more space to flow through. Now, during heavy rains, with the box culverts in place, the risk of the Napa Creek flooding has been reduced because the excess water flows through the box culverts.
In the 90s, when we started having frequent floods, the coalition was put together of city, county, environmental groups, and they worked with the Corps to come up with an environmentally superior design called the Living River. Instead of putting a concrete channel, you let the river breathe. You pull back development from the edges. You create flood terraces. So when the river floods, it doesn't create destruction, it just fills the terraces. And that's what they have done. They created hundreds and hundreds of new acres of wetlands down near the Butler Bridge. And they pulled back the river through the heart of town. They removed a lot of development along the river, and that's what we have now.
When Kevin mentioned wetlands, he was referring to this entire area where I'm standing now. About 600 acres of wetlands south of downtown Napa. This area not only has been left undeveloped to provide space for floodwaters, but also provides a habitat for wildlife and nature.
Outside of flood events, the South Napa wetland just across from Kennedy, the bird species have gone from 26 to well over 50 in 20 years.
Although people brought up plans and ideas for creating the flood control project, it took a long time for those plans to get into action. The city of Napa was finally able to get the Napa River Flood Project approved in 1998. Construction began in 2000. All told, the project is expected to cost over $400 million by completion. How was the city of Napa able to get this project funded?
The county of Napa has been extremely adept at securing funding for a large-scale capital improvement project like the Napa Flood Control Project.
Because so much of this project was federally funded, and people are constantly trying to get theirs and get it first. There's a lot of deal making, and ultimately you're just trying to get it, find the path of least resistance, find common ground, which is really what this river represents. It's the path of least resistance.
And because of the way that we've managed our both natural and virtual resources, we are seen as an ideal funding candidate by funders such as the federal government, the state of California, because the flood control project, like many other projects in this valley, have been jointly funded by money from all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, with matching grants from other organizations such as Caltrans to help fill out the picture of finishing the flood control project.
On one hand, it's getting it approved and making people believe and seeing the vision and the potential. It takes a completely different management style to execute that vision.
Once the Army Corps of Engineers and the locals agreed on living river rather than concrete channelization, the feds, the Corps, have used this as they've promoted us as a model project, as progressive flood control. And they have toured all kinds of officials from other parts of the country to see the Napa Flood Project, the new wetlands.
Well, the Napa Flood Control Project was the first of its kind in the country, really globally. There's a lot that makes it unique. What the project did was it reconnected the river to its natural floodplain and allowed water to flow through town naturally. And in order to do that, it required the Army Corps of Engineers to accept environmental benefits in their flood project, in the parameters of the project. So what that means is their cost-benefit analysis needed to value the environmental benefits and consider the recreational opportunities that were being built as a result.
The other thing that they've done in terms of conception is to link the Napa Valley to the first Bay Area and then West Coast hiking trails, so that we now have, partly through the work of the Flood Control Project, been able to open the valley up even further to people who want to walk into the valley, to people who want to hike into the valley, to people who want to ride their bicycles into the valley, and with ease of access throughout the entire valley with a series of bike trails and open spaces that are happening in conjunction with the Flood Control Project.
So I would say the Flood Project has remade the whole central swath of Napa, and it's opened it up to nature and birds, and it's a park, and there's a path that you can walk from 3rd Street down to Amola Bridge and Napa College. I mean, it's just beautiful. It was sold as flood control, but really it was almost like Napa rejuvenation as a side benefit. Yes, the fish benefit and the birds, but I would say developers are benefiting. People who live in homes that were flooding, once or twice a year, they're benefiting. It's a big thing.
What this project did was it was the beginning of a major shift down valley, and now they're talking about this town as Venice, with all the bridges and the water. It resembles Venice, and that was the big one.